Hello there, thanks for joining me. I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create artwork like Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock was a popular abstract expressionist painter from the 30s and 40s, and he kind of helped popularize that splattery paint kind of look. He helped people kind of appreciate non-realistic art, and so I think that's pretty cool. I'm going to show you how you can do that digitally using Corel Painter 2016's liquid ink and particle brushes combined together, which creates some nice organic splattery results that you can't get in any other digital painting program. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm using a canvas that is 20 inches wide by 10 inches tall at 300 pixels per inch, and we're going to want to have easy access to a few things here, like the flow maps and the papers. You can find these under the window menu. Paper panels, papers, and then flow map panels, flow maps. We'll want the advanced brush controls open. You can select those here so that we can get to the particle options and the liquid ink options. We're also going to want to have access to the layers palette. And I have some custom brushes that I made here for making these little liquid ink splats. And then I have a few brushes that are just standard. You can look under the liquid ink category, and there's a ton of different brushes that you can try out here. If you want to use these custom brushes here, you can download these from my website at aaronrutten.com. Let's go ahead and start by toning our canvas and adding some texture. So I'm going to go ahead and just select kind of a off-white cream color like this. I'm going to go to fill. You can also use Control F to fill really quickly. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call it overlay. I'm going to set the composite method to overlay. Then I'm going to select this 5 neutral gray value. You want your value to be set at 128 and then hue and saturation to be set at 0, so you get this neutral gray. We'll go ahead and fill that layer with that neutral gray. It's not going to look like it's doing anything because this overlay method is making that particular color of gray invisible. The advantage to doing that is if we add some canvas texture now, that canvas texture will be lighter and darker in some places, and so the canvas texture will essentially be on its own new layer. So if we go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture, we can play with the amount to change the amount of texture that we add. I'm going to increase that amount just a little bit and then click OK. Now zoomed out we won't see any texture, but if we zoom in really close, we're going to see that we have this nice canvas texture. Now it's going to look a little funny when you zoom out. It won't look that way when you print, so don't worry about it if you see any kinds of weird little moire patterns, which are like kind of blocky horizontal and vertical lines. That's just kind of a optical illusion that happens when you zoom in and out. Now we can reduce that effect a little bit by adding a mask to that layer, and we can select black. And then if we use the sponge to paint over that texture, we're going to mask away or conceal or essentially erase some of that texture in some places. Because in real life, a texture on a canvas wouldn't be completely uniform like it is here in the digital world. So we're adding a little bit of chaos to that. You can see if I zoom in now, it isn't completely even everywhere. There's some areas on the canvas that have more texture than others. If you wanted to, you could continue adding additional layers of overlay to add more texture. If you wanted to add other textures, you could do that. I'm going to go ahead and stick with this for now. I'm going to apply that layer mask by right-clicking on it and choosing Apply Layer Mask. That's going to permanently delete those concealed pixels. I recommend doing that because sometimes if you have too many complex masks on your layers, it might crash Painter. So go ahead and apply that mask, and then let's go ahead and just do a Save As to save a copy of our artwork. And then now we can start playing around with adding some paint. So when we use a liquid ink brush, which is what we're going to be using for this painting, it's going to automatically create its own layer when you paint with it. So if we select any of these brushes, let's try this splat brush here. I'm going to pick blue. I'm just going to tap and create a little splat. And depending on how hard and how fast I tap and the size of my brush, I'm going to get some very different results. Shorter, quicker taps tend to work better with this brush. You can make your brush really big, and then your splats will go further from your brush. Or you could just paint with it if you want. If you want to clear your canvas, you can do Select All, Clear Layer, Select None. These are custom shortcuts that I created, but you can also get to select from the Select menu and clear from the edit menu. Let's take a look at thin splats. That's a variation of the same brush, except the splats are a little bit thinner and spread out further, as you can see here. Let's take a look at hair. This is a brush that I was using to paint hair, but it also works really well to make little drippy streaks, like so. You can vary your pen pressure. If you use really light pressure, you're going to get kind of more of a broken up effect. Let's take a look at drops of ink. You're supposed to tap with this brush. Don't make your brush too big because this particular brush tends to work really slow if you make it too big. So I'd keep it kind of a small drop size and just tap with it. You can draw with it if you like. Next, we'll take a look at this graphic bristle. This is kind of a bristly brush. If you want kind of a ink bristle effect, you can also kind of tap with it too to get some little splatters. And the brush that's next to it, called graphic bristle resist, is going to eat away at that ink. You can tap or you can paint and kind of erode the ink. It's really interesting. So these brushes should be more than enough to create an abstract expressionist style painting. You can feel free to tweak these and make your own brushes, or you can visit the liquid ink brushes here, and there's a whole bunch of really good brushes for creating some expressionist effects. So let's go ahead and get started now. I'm going to use one of Jackson Pollock's well-known paintings called Autumn Rhythm for inspiration here. It has kind of a monochromatic color palette, which we're going to base off of our toned canvas color here. So the first color I'm going to pick is going to be kind of a gold, kind of gray color, something like this. So I picked orange for my hue first, and then I decided how saturated I wanted the color to be and how bright in value or dark in value I wanted it to be. I think I want it to be right around here. Let's just do a little test. Let's use the splat brush for this. So I think I like that color. Let's take a look at some of the options that we can play with here. If we look at the particles, we can change the amount of little particles of paint that come off of the brush. We can play with how those particles move around, whether or not they wiggle around on their own or not. If we look under flow particles, we have a few options here. We can also look under liquid ink, and there's a whole bunch of options to control the ink. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these options because that would make this video way too long. If you want to know what something is going to do, just hover over the name here and it's going to give you a little tooltip that'll tell you. You can just hover over all these and get an idea for what these settings do. But for these particular brushes, I have them kind of all set up to where I don't really need to ever play with any of these settings because I can get the effects I want just from picking a different brush. But these options are here if you want to use them. You can also change the thickness of the paint. If you double click to the right of the liquid ink layer, you'll open up the liquid ink layer attributes. And if you increase the amount, it's going to give you some elevation to your paint. You can see how it sticks up off the canvas. I'm going to double click on that layer. I'm going to reduce the amount so that it's not so strong. I think something like that looks pretty good. And I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so I can see my whole canvas. I want to make sure I give myself a little bit of buffer room here so I don't accidentally click one of these palettes by mistake. And I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to spontaneously just add some paint here. However I feel like doing it. You're just kind of expressing yourself in a non-realistic way when you're painting this way. This isn't about trying to paint something that looks like something. I'm going to pick a different brush here. I'm going to go with this hair brush. When people are appreciating your art, if it's abstract expressionism, people are appreciating things like the form that your paint makes, the texture, the colors that you choose, the patterns that the paint makes. And people who appreciate that kind of art, they like kind of chaotic, organic looking things. And so what you want is brushes or a media that kind of takes the control away from you. And this brush, or these liquid ink brushes, especially with the particles attached to them, they kind of do what they want. And you have some control over your work, but for the most part, you're going to get this really nice, organic, chaotic look. So I'm just kind of tapping, painting, dripping, drizzling. Every now and then I'll change my brush size. Add some little drizzles here. Pressing down harder, and that gives me some more little streaks of paint. But you kind of want to think about the direction of the paint. Pretend that you're throwing the paint while you're painting here, and have things kind of go in a direction like they've been tossed and thrown and splattered. Let's try some other brushes. Let's try the drops. Add some little drops in here. And if you want this to look organic, you really just want to do it spontaneously. You don't want to overthink it or think too much about it. You just want to put in detail. There should be variety between the different shapes that you're doing and the different patterns. For something to really truly be random, you don't want it to be an even distribution. You do want to have some areas where there's nothing and some areas where there's something, because if you just fill this whole thing up and you don't leave any negative space, it's not going to look good. Okay, so now I think we can pick another color. Let's go ahead and pick white. And let's add some splats. Maybe we'll do the thin splats this time. Add in some of those. Now I think maybe what we'll do, we'll backtrack a little bit here, do a few undos. Let's go ahead and add a new layer. And that way when we paint with this white, it's not going to have that 3D effect that we added when we went into the amount and increased the amount, because that was actually making that white appear kind of gray by adding some shadows to it, which I don't particularly want for this piece. I want this white to be bright. I'm going to switch to the liquid ink splats, make some bigger splats. Make my brush bigger. I'm just kind of building this up in layers. Maybe these white areas will be a little more prominent since they stand out. Maybe they'll be kind of bigger chunky shapes, whereas the first color that I picked, that kind of brownish gold muted color, is kind of more evenly distributed. So you don't want to just paint arbitrarily necessarily. You do want to think about the story behind the piece and maybe add some kind of logic to it. And just kind of do what you feel like. Just express yourself, you know? That's the fun about this particular way of painting. You can really do whatever you want. Nobody can judge you on this and say, oh, that doesn't look like a bunch of splatters. You know, if you were painting a house or an apple or a dog or something, people would judge you on that and say whether or not they think it looks like that particular subject. But for this is your own thing. You can do whatever you want here. Nobody can say anything about it. I'm going to switch to the hairbrush and add some drizzles. I know that name is a little confusing, but in other tutorials it is a hairbrush. It gives you some little strands, like so. Now if you do something too big and you kind of mess it up, you can always go in with this graphic bristle resist and eat away at it a little bit, like so. I'm going to add some drops. Don't be afraid to go off the edges of your canvas. It's all too easy to keep everything centered. Then it won't look right. Because if you were really throwing paint at a canvas in real life, it would be going off the canvas. You'd be making a huge mess all over your studio. I can only imagine what this guy's floors and walls looked like. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's add another layer so that we can separate our layers. These are just kind of blank layers. You could eventually just delete these if you want, but what they're doing is they're forcing that liquid ink to go on a separate layer, because if you keep painting with liquid ink on a liquid ink layer, it's going to add to that layer. I think having them separate is kind of nice, because then you can change the color or just repaint that layer if you wanted to. So I've created that new layer just to separate the liquid ink layer from the new liquid ink layer we're about to make with the splat brush and black. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. I'm going to try to make some of these black areas a little bit more deliberate so that they're more interesting. So I'm going to just make up some little shapes. If you wanted to, you could, you know, add details. You could do a portrait of a person or make a silhouette of an animal or just about anything. Add some dark area over here. I'm trying to make a nice balance of all of these different colors in this piece. You know, I don't want to cover up too much of anything. just want some of it to kind of blend together. As you can hear, I'm just tapping. Because if you press and you hold too long, kind of looks like spaghetti. You know, that might be the effect you want in some places, but I want it to look like it's dripping. Now this is really cool because you can't get this in earlier versions of Painter. You know, they didn't even have the particle brushes until Painter 2015, but you weren't able to combine the liquid ink brushes with the particle brushes until Painter 2016. It's a really cool feature. Now, when I'm placing things, sometimes I'm looking for areas that I don't like, and so I'm covering them up with something else. Sometimes I'm looking for areas that are missing content, like right here, there's kind of nothing going on, so maybe that's a good place to add a little bit of visual interest. Sometimes I'm thinking about contrast. If I put this black on top of this white, I'm going to have a lot more impact. I'm going to do some drops here with the drops brush. See, there's a nice variety of shapes here. Now it looks like all kinds of stuff was going on this canvas. And it's going to take quite a bit of work. You can really add as much detail as you want. I'm going kind of quick here because this is just going to be a demonstration. But if I were painting something that wasn't a tutorial, then I would probably spend a bit more time on it and put a little bit more thought into it. I'm just kind of going at it here. And every once in a while, it's good to zoom out and just kind of look at your piece from a distance, see how it feels, and then zoom back in and work on it more. I think we need a few black drizzles here, so I'm going to select the hairbrush. Add some little drizzles here and there. And I'll select the graphic bristle resist. I'll just tap here and there in a few places just to erode some of that ink. Now I know these are called liquid ink brushes, but you could imagine that this is even some other kind of paint. You're really just getting kind of an ink splattering effect. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be ink as a medium. Let's go ahead and save a copy of our artwork by doing Save As. I'm just going to call this 3. I'm just saving numbered iterations here. Now let's go ahead and do a little bit of blending. We want to go ahead and merge our paint layers, but we want to keep our canvas here separate so that we don't blend away our canvas texture. So let's select just those paint layers, and we'll hit Control E to merge them together. I'm just going to call that layer Paint. Now we can use some of these custom blender brushes that I created, or you can look at the blenders category and experiment with some of the blenders here. You're going to want to make sure you're using enhanced layer blending so that you don't get any white fringe when you blend. I'm going to use the grainy speckle drip smear brush, and I'm going to go in here and you can tap, you can blend, you can do really whatever you want. See how that's giving you some nice organic effects, like the ink or the paint is kind of blending into the canvas. So I'm just going to do that here and there kind of spontaneously just to kind of mix things up a little bit. If the edges are looking too flat or too digital, that's a good candidate for a place to blend it up a little bit. So what you're doing now is you're just trying to make it look even more organic. You're adding all this fine detail. If you zoom into this to 100%, you can see all that detail that's getting added just by blending. All that detail adds more and more visual interest. It's more places that people will appreciate when they're looking at this piece. So I'm just tapping and tapping and tapping. You know, I'm thinking quickly. I'm making quick decisions. I'm not just tapping for no reason at all. Hunting around for places that I think need work, but I'm also trying to be kind of spontaneous and quick about it. It's a fine balance that you develop over time as an artist, I think. It's kind of artist's intuition. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and see how this is looking. Now it's starting to look really nice and organic and expressive. Let's try some of these other blenders. Let's try Oily Blender 2. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. Just let you kind of pull out the paint in an oily kind of way. Could just use this to paint over a few places here and there and kind of mix it up just to smudge some edges. Let's try coarse oily blender speckle. You can kind of tap with that and get some fine speckly effects. Works pretty well to break up some of the edges. Let's try another blender. Let's try coarse smear blender jitter 2. Kind of tap with that brush. It just kind of mixes stuff up, adds a little bit of grain. Don't forget about the edges of the canvas. Those are always good places to blend too. We'll zoom out and see how we're looking. It's starting to come together. Let's go back to our splat brush. Let's select black. Let's make our brush as big as we can, and let's add a splat. We kind of build one up here with multiple strokes. And then what do we do if we want a really big splat? Because this brush is going to kind of top out and not get very big. What you can do is you can go ahead and free transform this splat since it's on a layer. So I'm going to click on free transform, convert it to a default layer, and then I'm just going to scale it up like so. And now we have a much bigger splat that we can reposition. And we can of course do that again. We can add some more splats here like this. We can hit Control T for free transform. That's a custom shortcut that I made. You get to free transform from the edit menu. I'm going to go ahead and click on the check to commit to this transformation and move that splat. So we want there to be a nice balance of large and small details. Let's go ahead and add a white splat. I'm going to use the thin splats for this. Let's go ahead and scale that up with Control T or edit free transform. And then move that wherever you want it to go. I'm going to go ahead and select the drops brush, maybe add a few more little drops here and there, and we'll go ahead and wrap this piece up. Maybe just a couple more little splats too. We'll zoom out one more time to evaluate. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and merge all these paint layers by selecting them all and then doing Control E to merge them. Call that layer paint. Create a new layer. I'm going to call it overlay top. I'm going to change it to the overlay composite method and select that neutral gray. I'm going to fill the canvas with that gray. And I'm going to use that same paper texture artist canvas. And I'm going to choose Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. And click OK. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to see what effect it's had on my paint. You can see it's added some texture. Now, if this paint is thick, we don't want it to have too much texture showing. So we can go ahead and reduce the opacity of that till we have just a little bit of texture, like so. Let's also add a mask to that layer, select black, select the sponge, and just paint over the whole canvas with the sponge a little bit to break up some of that texture. And then we'll right click on that layer mask and choose Apply Layer Mask. Let's go ahead and save a copy of our artwork. And there you go, we have a finished abstract expressionist painting in the style of Jackson Pollock. If you're interested in making your own custom brushes, there's some settings that you should look at. First of all, you'll want to open your General panel here. That's found under Window, Brush Control Panels, General. And this is basically all of the possible settings that you could add to a brush in Painter. It's different than the advanced brush controls, which is just kind of a narrowed down version that only really reveals the relevant features that you could use for that particular brush. But it doesn't show you everything because there's some things hiding in General here that you can access as well. So right now I'm using this brush that is called Ink Hair. I'm just going to go ahead and reset it back to its default state. And it works like how we were using it earlier. But I can do a lot of things to modify this brush. For one, I can go into the spacing and I can increase the spacing if I want these little dots to be further apart. That might be too far, so I'm going to go ahead and decrease that. If I decrease it too much, I'm just going to get a solid thick line, like so. So spacing works pretty well to give you kind of a drippy, drizzly effect. Let's check out size. You can add size jitter if you want the size to vary along the stroke. So some of the drops will be wide and then some of them will be skinny. I'm going to reduce the spacing a little more so we can see this size difference. I'm going to add more size jitter. You can see that the brush really varies in size a whole lot. And we can smooth that out with smoothness to make it look a little more organic. We can play with the bristles in the brush. If we want fewer bristles, then we'll increase the feature. We can spread the bristles out. Then we have a lot of control over the liquid ink and the way that it works with the liquid ink palette. You can always hover over these options to get a little tooltip that'll tell you what this option does. Let's look at stroke jitter. Stroke jitter will work kind of like size jitter, except it's going to make the stroke kind of vary from left to right as you paint it. Let's add a lot of stroke jitter. You can see that it moves around quite a bit. Now if you create a brush and you want to save it, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to Brushes, Save Variant, give it a unique name. I'll call this one Wild Drizzle, and I'm going to save it in my own custom brush category. You can create one of those by clicking this plus. I'm going to click on Save. And now if I look in the bottom of that category, there's Wild Drizzle, along with any of the other brushes that I've created in that category. Now while you were creating that variant, you may have changed some of the properties for a current brush, like this ink hair. And if you want to reset that brush back to its default settings, you can just click on Reset Tool. That'll put it back to how it was before you made any changes to the settings. Let's take a look at some other ways to tweak these brushes. In the General palette, let's look under Dab Type, and there are options for liquid ink. There's camel hair, flat, palette knife, bristle spray, airbrush. You can try all of these settings. It'll give you different results. But what's really worth looking at are the liquid ink gravity particles, flow particles, and spring particles. This is new to Painter 2016 where you can connect liquid ink to the particle technology. So let's try liquid ink gravity and let's see what that does. And you can see those little particles move around and follow the brush. We could change the way that those particles follow by going to the Particles palette here. We could decrease the damping, we could increase the chaos, and these particles will move around a little differently. We can reduce the count. There'd be fewer particles. There's options for each particular subcategory of particles. For instance, gravity particles has its own subcategory. So I can increase the velocity. These particles will move faster. I can increase the acceleration and the spin rate. And I'll get some really interesting results here. Let's try one of the other particle options. Let's do flow particles. And that also has its own palette here that we can use along with the regular particles palette. And you can still make changes to the liquid ink palette as well if you want to change the properties of the ink itself. So let's look at flow particles that kind of flow off of your brush. It's kind of interesting. Now we can reduce the position jitter. That'll make the particles move a little bit less. We can increase the count so there's more particles, or decrease the count so there's very few particles. We can increase and decrease the chaos to make the particles move around more randomly. You can also add force if you want to move the particles in a particular direction. You'll want to pick a direction, and the particles will kind of spray out in that direction, or kind of favor that direction. You can see here if I paint really fast, they're all kind of leaning in one direction. If I change the direction and I paint, now they're all kind of going down. So you could think of force like wind. Maybe something is kind of blowing on the paint and blowing it in a certain direction. There's flow map. You can of course use that with the flow maps to influence the way that the paint and ink kind of flows and moves around. You can look in the flow maps, and flow maps gives you a little more control over how your paint is going to contour and flow. So for example, I'm going to select this clouds flow map, and I'm going to look over here in my advanced brush controls for particles common, and flow map will control the strength of the flow map. You can of course change that flow map to any of these other flow maps, and if you want it to flow into the map more, you increase this. If you don't want it to flow as much, you decrease it. So I'll pick a nice bright color that you can see here, And I'll go ahead and just use no flow map as an example. So you can see the particles just kind of do their own thing. If I set flow map to 100%, I do that same brush stroke, you can see that they get kind of confined into the little fractal cracks and shapes in that flow map. Let's try another option. That is liquid ink spring particles. And these just kind of spring around, especially if you move your brush really fast. You'll really see how springy it gets. There's a spring particles option to change the different kinds of spring particles, so I can make like a chain. Make some interesting results. Or I can choose the nucleus. Gives me a different kind of result. I can change the random length of the particles. And the stiffness, if I want to make it more or less stiff. And I can go back to the particles and I can add particles. You don't want to add too many because that'll really slow it down. But you can see there's really a lot that you can do by tweaking all of these settings. And with that, we have a finished tutorial. I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you did, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends. And if you appreciate all the free digital art tutorials I'm making, please consider making a donation at patreon.com/AaronRutton to help me continue making videos like this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.